music to the noise, yeah, the mess we make. Machine Pun Kelly get caught in the fake. Facts and logic with a twist of jest. Strip it down to truth, yeah, forget the rest. Humor pulls the lies right out of the park. Look beyond the shadows that set the dark. Sparks of laughter fire up the night, bringing clarity when they blur the fight. Cut through the chaos, yeah, the tangle rise. Steam Fun Kelly with a set of clear eyes. Truths and jokes gonna rock this show. Step into light where the real facts glow.
Hello. Today we're joined by Patrick Chovanec.
Yes.
Chovanec. I was like, I started to try to say it the first time in my head, and I'm like, there is no way I'm going to get through this without mutilating it. Once I had I was going through you go through customs. I was going through customs at the airport, and somebody tried to say my name, and they said it's Scarletta, and I'm like, no, that's Scaletta. And it's like, for some reason, everybody wants to put an R in there all the time. I'm like, no, it's Scaletta. It's my own name. I'm pretty sure I know how to pronounce it. She was trying to correct me. Anyway, so since I started this show about a year ago, I've been trying to really learn and understand the economy beyond just basic stuff and how it works. And what I found is to me, the economy is like trying to understand the economy without actually having an education on it is like trying to put together the Death Star Lego set without the instructions. You might not be able to figure out what some of the pieces are and everything, but you can't ever figure out how to put them all together. And
well, economists with plenty of training have the same challenge. So
that is I've had two guests that have a PhD from Wharton, but they're both in healthcare, and they're microeconomists, which is apparently asking a chemical engineer to do chemistry or something. And it's total. You know the difference between a chemical engineer and a chemist?
Tell me.
A chemical engineer washes their hands before they go to the bathroom.
Okay.
Because they're working with the chemicals and stuff. So you're an economist that's been working in the private sector for a long time. You also went to Wharton, right?
Yes.
And you got a master's from Wharton?
Yes. And met my wife there, which is
as anything else. So you got a degree and a wife out of it. So I'm glad, I'm really happy that you're coming on, because I've been trying to, research into what kind of impact Trump's policies are going to be having on the economy. And there's a lot of things that seem to, possibly overlap here. And so there's Trump's tariffs,
right?
There his mass deportations, and then there's the austerity in the big beautiful bill, which for those who don't know what austerity means, it means spending cuts. Right, massive,
whether it's under DOGE or through legislation or from this government shutdown that we're currently in, and the threat of he's saying that there'll be layoffs that are permanent, right? So
right. So all of that seems like a perfect storm for a really, really bad economy. So let's start off with just and one of the things that I actually had to learn, what is GNP?
Gross national product. It's actually GDP is what most economists talk about now. GDP.
GDP is
gross domestic product.
Yeah, right. So GDP. Sorry. Yeah.
Slightly different. We used to, when I was growing up, always talk about GNP, and then it shifted. But it's basically just a measure of activity. It's a measure of how much spending is going on in the economy, and spending being whether it's by the government, by companies investing, consumers buying things, and it's adjusted for how much of that is being produced abroad versus how much of that's being produced at home, which is where net exports play a role.
And that's where the GNP versus GDP comes in.
And it's just a measure of economic activity. It doesn't tell you necessarily how good that activity is, whether it's good for the long term or good for the bad term. It just means that people are out there spending money on things that presumably have value.
And so there's 4 things that compose it, right?
Yeah. So I kind of referred to them right there, which is consumption. Then there's investment, government spending, which is kind of a composition of consumption and investment, but it's coming from the government and
that's like all government, right? Not just the federal government,
state and local as well as. That's right. And then net exports is really an adjustment. Sometimes people think, it means that exports add to the economy and imports subtract from the economy. And that's not really, it's an adjustment to say, okay, so we know how much consumers, the government, and businesses were spending. Well, how much of that how does that relate to output? And if we're importing more than we're exporting or vice versa, that transition has to be made, because what we're really measuring is output. We're really trying to get at how much the economy is producing.
So like in the first quarter, net exports were way up because everybody was trying to get ahead of the tariffs. Then in the second quarter, they were way down because
I think it was the opposite. I think it was that imports surged in the beginning of the year.
I'm sorry.
Which would actually drive down net exports, right? And then it flipped because they had already done that, and then the tariffs kicked in. So there's been a kind of a whiplash effect when you one of the things that I do every quarter is when the headline GDP number comes out, it's very easy actually to go to the release, and if you know what you're looking for, kind of take it apart and say, all right, so we have this headline number, it's 3% or it's -1% or whatever, right? What's going on here? So what is the composite? How's consumer spending doing? How is business investment doing? How is the housing market doing in particular? How much of this is sometimes output is affected by things like there's a temporary buildup in inventory or depletion of inventory of things that have already been built up. Then what is government spending doing on the federal level, whether it's defense or whether it's non-defense spending, and on the state and local level, what's happening there? And then last, how much of this has been affected by changes in exports and imports? And so one of the things that happened in the last couple of quarters is there was a real whiplash effect when it came to exports and imports, because not so much with exports, but imports, because with the coming tariffs, there was a surge of people trying to build up inventory in imports that they wouldn't have to pay taxes on now, but then maybe they wouldn't be able to acquire except at a much more expensive price later. And so they built up inventory and they imported a lot, and that had a really strange effect on GDP. And then when that ended, that also had a very strange effect on GDP. So you really have to kind of, instead of just looking at the headline number, go into the weeds and say how strong is this economy really? And my takeaway from the last quarter's worth of GDP is that when you take away that whiplash effect, this is an economy that it's not in recession, but it's walking on eggshells. It's sluggish. It's tentative. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. There's a lot of reluctance to really commit to making long-term investments and to spending money on things that, you're not worried that, oh, I made a mistake, I overspent. And so there's a hesitancy because people just don't know what's around the corner. We're always one tweet away from the promise of Armageddon. And so even businesses that might like the extension of Trump's tax cuts or whatever, they are very wary of making decisions and committing to decisions in this kind of an environment.
Except for the AI. Like AI is, for some reason, like AI is, is it true that AI is kind of holding up the economy, maybe even a little artificially?
From all that I have read, that it's a big driver of investment. Now, there are two ways to interpret that, right? The first is, so I have friends and colleagues in the economics business and the investment advisory business who take a very sanguine attitude about the economy right now and about the market. Because one of the big questions is, okay, if there are all these concerns, there's such disruptive economic policy making, why is the market doing so well? It's been going up and up and up, and the valuations are very high, and what's not to like, right? And that also, by the way, gives some people, especially on the wealthier end, a little bit more confidence to go out and spend money. So it actually keeps the real economy going a bit. And people, I think anyone who looks at these policy issues and is, the kind of erratic policy making that's going on has to wonder, okay, well, what's going on here? Why is this all really nothing? And we should be ignoring it and focusing on the good things that are happening in the economy, or is the market really missing something? And the argument that they make is twofold. The argument that they make is, first of all, that, well, 15% tariffs, while bad for the economy, slightly negative, are not enough to derail the economy. They impose a cost, but they're not enough to derail the economy. The second argument is that at the same time that this is taking place, there's this boom, the big boom in AI, and that AI will be productivity enhancing and a big boost to the economy, and that's why there's a good future out there for economic growth. I would question both of those things. The first, which is 15% tariffs are negative, but not that big of a deal, I think ignores the bigger picture, which is that all the disruption, if you were certain that tomorrow it would just be 15% tariffs across the board, you could say, well, I don't really like that policy, but hey, okay, it's a negative, but there are other good things that are happening. But you don't know. Tomorrow there could be another announcement, and then it's pulled back, and then now we're at tariff war with Brazil, or now we're at tariff war with India, and we're always one tweet away from something that's disruptive. And I think that there's
it seems like a lot of the attention ends up being on like the major auto manufacturers and how they're affected, and not the farmer in Idaho and how he's affected.
I think everybody, right, in this environment is facing all kinds of uncertainty. And if you go, there's actually a survey that's regularly done by a group called ISM, or Institute of Supply Management. And they come up with two surveys. One is for manufacturers and one is for service companies. And what's interesting about it is not just that you get a number, which actually shows the economy in mild contraction, but you're also able to read the comments that come back in those surveys.
What is this?
This is called the ISM survey, or the ISM index.
And if somebody were to just Google it, they could find it?
ISM manufacturing or ISM services, and you'll come up to their webpage. And when you actually dig into it, you can read a summary of businesses replying and saying what's going on in their industry. And they are absolutely screaming about tariffs, partly because of the cost impact on them, but partly just because it makes it impossible to plan. They just don't know what's coming around the corner. And I think that bigger uncertainty is that introduces an effect that, say, okay, we have a tariff policy that maybe not everybody likes, that doesn't. And it reminds me of back around the time of the global financial crisis, when people would do analysis of the subprime housing market, and they'd say it's not that big, really. It's even if it goes bust, that's not going to pull down the rest of the
What's
economy.
the worst that could happen?
But what they ignored was that when the rug came out from under subprime, everything was called into question. And nobody knew who could pay what, and that created a cascading effect. And that's I think the bigger issue here when it comes to tariffs and all these and you mentioned a couple other policies that add to that, which is what's around the next corner. And people don't like it when they don't know what's around the next corner. The second thing is AI, and you were asking about that. I'm of the mind that we are in a bubble. And it reminds me a lot of the dot-com bubble when it comes to AI. Now, when people hear you say that, they think, oh, you're saying AI has nothing to it and there's no value to it. No.
Yeah, the dot-com had value to it.
Dot-com had value. But the problem is that not every dot-com was going to be Google. And, remember pets.com and things like that. And also all the broadband that they were building out at that time, because that was also that was sort of the hidden bubble that took place, was they overbuilt broadband. And ultimately we're using it. That's great. But a lot of companies went bust in the process. So just as there were bubbles when it came to railroads back in the 19th century, it's not to say that railroads weren't a real technology and didn't have value, but it also, it meant that there were lots of times when railroads overbuilt or built in the wrong place, and that people just were so enthusiastic, they put really high valuations and they invested a bunch of money that didn't earn a return. And that's what I see taking place in AI today. And the thing about bubbles is not just that, oh, you invest money and you don't get a return. It's also that it sucks investment funds away from other things.
I see, yeah.
Right. Because everybody's chasing after something they think is going to be big, and they're more reluctant to invest in things that maybe
they're afraid of missing out,
but they're important for the underlying health of the economy.
They're trying to buy into the next Google and maybe missing out on, something else.
Right. So for both of those reasons, that's why
really
I'm not as sanguine about what we see going on with either the market or the economy today. And I'm more concerned that there's going to be some kind of reckoning.
So like all that investment in AI could boost GDP or could boost GDP artificially.
So when GDP measures investment, it doesn't measure whether investment is good or bad ultimately.
Right. It's just new, or it just counts as new investment, right?
Yeah. And I'm having flashbacks to when I spent much of my career in China and moved back to the United States about a decade ago. And I argued at the time that China was in a housing bubble, a real estate bubble. And again, it wasn't that people didn't need houses. It's a billion people in China, they need houses. But could they afford what was being built and not sacrifice other things in the economy? And I mean, it added to GDP. There was no question that building lots of luxury condos that were empty added to Chinese GDP in the short run. But in the long run, it created a big overhang that now is really pulling down on the Chinese economy.
So, like connected to this is we talked a little bit in DMs just about like trust and antitrust laws and things like that, and how maybe those things you had mentioned that Trump's policies on those are also having an impact on the economy.
So the broader concern that I have, people can debate what the optimal antitrust policy should be. And there are different thoughts about whether we should be concerned about concentration in certain industries like high tech, like AI, right, or not. And I'd say we can have that policy debate, but the end of that policy debate should be for something that is a policy that's even-handed and benefits everyone. That's the criteria, right? To evaluate whether an antitrust policy, whether it's more laissez-faire or whether it's more intrusive and restrictive is a good thing or not.
So the most important thing is it's equal across the board. You're not
That
punishing people that criticize you and rewarding people that praise you.
Right. And that's the concern that I have about tariff policy, about antitrust policy, about a whole bunch of things in the Trump administration, is that it seems like it's far from transparent, that it's very transactional, that if you meet with the president, maybe you get an exemption from tariffs that were hurting you, and then you get an advantage over all the rest of the people in the economy who still have to pay those tariffs. All the other competitors that you have who didn't have that White House access, that didn't flatter him in the same way, that didn't buy Trump coin, that whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have, and I'll say I've had people who I know from DC who work as lobbyists who say, yeah, it is, you get a meeting if you are doing business with Trump and the Trump family in some way, shape, or form. And yes, of course, there's personal connections have always mattered, and the ability to get in the door and get a hearing have always been, it's uneven, right? But it's never been as blatant as this. And what that results, that creates an economy that's kind of a crony economy. Where,
isn't that like corporatism? Like, I know we're not supposed to use the F word, and by that I mean fascism, but you know, like this idea that fascism is, you know, like you're burning, you're gassing 6 million Jews, or it's not fascism. Like Mussolini fascism, doesn't that have a lot of exactly what you're talking about right now?
Right.
Elements
So one of the tenets of fascism was a corporatist view of the economy, right? It was they called themselves, it's contentious to say this, but so National Socialism, they called themselves socialists. And what they meant was they were non-Marxist socialists in the sense that they rejected class struggle in favor of sort of a national unity. But they believed that the government should be managing the economy, and that the private sector should be responsive to state direction. Mm-hmm. And whether that was the clique in power, or whether that was something that was more just national greatness or whatever, that the state would be picking winners and losers. And if you were on board and in good with the state, then you would profit. And if you're not, then you would actually be expropriated. And even going back to kind of Nazi Germany, Hugo Juncker's airplane company, he actually was opposed to the Nazis, and he got his aircraft manufacturing company taken away from him because for that very reason. And the idea of corporatism, right, is that you play ball with the government, and the government plays ball with you. Mm-hmm. And I worry about this development of crony capitalism, where the basis for competing is not, can you produce the best product in a competitive marketplace, but how well connected you are. And economists have a term for this. It's called rent-seeking behavior. And what they mean by that is that you're seeking market advantages that don't derive from what you're selling to people. You're seeking market advantages that come from stacking the political deck. And
there's a certain irony to this when you can consider like their anti-DEI, it should be just merit type thing, which I guess only applies to Black people that want to be pilots or whatever.
Yeah, and I could go into a whole thing about why we need more pilots from DEI. You know, DEI in the airline industry was all about outreach to people who had never considered entering aviation.
Because there's a major pilot shortage.
We have a pilot shortage, and it was never about replacing qualified people with unqualified people. It was about getting more people in the pool. But anyway, that's a whole different discussion. The concern I have is not necessarily, on one level, yes, I'm concerned about, is a tariff policy a good policy? Is a antitrust policy a good policy? Is spending policy a good policy? But there's a sort of meta discussion here, which is, are those policies being adopted on the basis of a debate over what's really for the public good, and we can disagree about those things, or are they being essentially favors being parceled out that advantage some people and disadvantage others, and that the criteria is to getting good with the politicians who are in power, and then the wealth flows from that. And I think that is, look, coming from a former lifelong Republican, limited government, free market kind of guy, that's not what I signed up for. That's not what I believed in. And I have a big problem with that.
So do you think that this ties into like what you were speaking about first, further just makes that destabilization, that uncertainty even more delicate? Because you don't know who's going to piss off Donald Trump from one day to the next. And then the social media comes out. And this thing that he just yesterday, he was praising, this person. And today he's persona non grata, and his stock, his company's stock dumps,
we have an economy of people who are lying low, of corporate leaders who are lying low, trying not to attract negative attention from the White House. And that actually has cost in and of itself. It's funny because, again, I'm reminded of my experiences in China. And one of the criticisms that I always had of the way that Xi Jinping was managing the economy was he was so tight-fisted in terms of political control that he ended up suppressing any kind of initiative, either policy-wise or even within the private sector, because you always wanted to check and make sure you were good with the government before you did anything. And so what you had was an economy of people who were trying to tailor themselves to, in China, the 5-year plan, and say, oh, okay, how does what I'm doing fit in with what the leader wants to have happen? And here, the agenda is different. And the criteria is different. It's more narcissistic, and who can flatter him the most, and, and give him a political win in the news. But the result is the same, where people are not making business decisions based on business. They're making business decisions based on politics. And that creates malinvestment in the economy.
Man, I'm going to have to ferment on that for a while.
It's funny because I keep on referring back to my experiences in China. And when I talk to people who were economists or journalists in China at the time that I was, they get this. They see it. They see the parallels. And they keep on saying, wow, I never thought. And it's funny, especially funny because, right, Trump is anti-China and presents himself as a China hawk and has been surrounded by people who are like, oh, CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is the most evil thing on the face of the earth. And yet, in many ways, they either consciously or unconsciously are mimicking many of the ways that China governs its own economy. And
there's some people that say that, it's not so like we look at a political spectrum from right to left. But some people say it's a political circle, and just authoritarianism is actually just kind of the top of the circle. Robert Frost wrote a poem one time called "I Support a Semi-Revolution," and I think it goes, "I support a semi-revolution. The problem with a total revolution is, ask any reputable Rosicrucian, the same ones always end up on top." Like if the wheel turns all the way around, you're just, got the same people up there. So he wants, let's just get the bottom to the top and just a half turn. I'd love that. That's my favorite poem of his, by the way.
So one thing that you mentioned that we haven't talked about is mass deportations and the effect that could have.
And can we also on that, like, also focus on Main Street? Like, so much of the economy gets focused on Wall Street, and we've got farms that are going to go under. And like, we've lost, I think, 500,000 farms since 1980, privately owned farms. Which is because of a lot of what you're talking about already with with consolidation of not just farm ownership, but seed ownership, the grocery store ownership, all of these things. squeeze the farmers harder and harder. You've got the tariffs, like fertilizers going up, seeds are going up, feed is going up for the cattle, all of that kind of stuff. And the farmers are already right now limited. And then when you add mass deportations onto that, or like 40% of the workforce, is not showing up to work, that's not going to be good for farmers, and that's not going to be good for us.
Right. So American agriculture is an export-oriented business. The U.S. produces a surplus of food, and it's a food exporter. So anything that leads to a trade war leaves any kind of export sector very vulnerable to retaliation, vulnerable to the price increases, all sorts of things, right? So there's that. And then you've got this murky issue of, and it is murky, to try to quantify exactly what the effect of mass deportations will be on the farming sector. Because we as a country, the framing of the illegal immigration issue is always, oh, those people coming across and they're the ones who are breaking the law. And it's very rarely discussed, honestly, that there are entire industries that rely on the availability of this labor and hire them illegally. And if they're not there, right, then that's a big gaping hole in the U.S. economy that we have yet to figure out exactly how we want to fill. And so to see it simply as a law enforcement issue and not understand our complicity, all of our complicity in this economic reality that whether it's, especially in agriculture.
And it's not like people say, well, why don't they just do it the right way? And it's like, first of all, the right way isn't that easy. Secondly,
the right way would either be have large scale immigration of those people, or to have some kind of guest worker program. But none of those things are popular among people who oppose.
And none of the
immigration.
None of those things are real. Like the farmer, like the small farmer that's barely making it, and the average extra to bring over someone on I think it's an H-2A visa, which is the legal way to do it, costs about $7,000 more per worker, and they're making negative $900 a year on average. So it's not like they can afford these 10 visas. The corporate farmers can, but the small farmers.
I think we're just not being very honest with ourselves about the dynamics of this immigration issue.
Yeah.
Right? That we just want to say, oh, they're all breaking the law, so let's kick them out. And then not understanding why they're here in the first place and what attracted them here in the first place, and how that the U.S. economy is intimately connected with that. And it is hard to quantify because we're not completely honest and open about it, right? What the effect of taking that away suddenly will be. And I also think that initially they were rounding up people. It's interesting to see where they're rounding up people for deportation, right?
Yeah.
Initially, they started to round up people at farms, and then the farmers started screaming, saying, if you do this, right, we're not going to be able to harvest the crops. And then that's a key constituency for Trump in red states. And so it seems like they backed off of that a bit. And now so where are they making their numbers? They're hanging around courts, right, in urban areas. And this is the great irony, is that they're hanging around courts, picking up people who are going into court, right, to be legal, to comply with the law, even if they're not compliant at the moment, or they're at least trying to maintain a legal status. And then the moment they lose it, they're grabbed. These are not the problem. These are
you know where they're not going? They're not going where these so-called gang members are,
because
they might get shot. Like that might actually
mean hard. That's hard work to actually. You can't make your numbers by go. This is the thing: is it's much easier to make your numbers by picking up law-abiding people who have a slight issue with their immigration issue that they're trying to work through, than it is to make your numbers by going after hardened criminals.
Right.
You got to. They're not showing up to court and saying, arrest me.
Do you think it's like, well, like even just on I've been thinking about this and I want to do some research on it to make sure I know what I'm talking about, but maybe you do. I just think about American history and how our economy has evolved over the years. And it seems like throughout our history, the hard work is by immigrants, people that wanted to come over here to get a better life, and there's also the slave trade, which not to obviously dismiss that,
no, right.
but in Texas they want us to call them immigrants, believe it or not. But even then, like there were still like large amounts of Irish that were brought over as indentured servants, and they've done the hard work, the backbreaking work. It's not the rich white people that have been out there, tilling the farms. And and then like in the 1800s, there was different masses of people, including the Irish again, and then and then there were the Eastern Europeans, there were the Italians, and like there's always been a group of people, whether it's from Europe or wherever, that have come over to do the work from the bottom, and our economy has always relied on that kind of immigration. And now we're saying, oh, we don't want that anymore. And we're also looking around saying, oh, we're not, growing enough. And so nobody's going to be able to do this work. It seems to me oxymoronic.
So to think about it from an economic point of view, right? I actually, one of the things I did in China was teach U.S. business history or U.S. economic history.
Oh, okay.
Which was an interesting thing because there were a lot of parallels that you could draw between what was going on in China at the time and historical developments in the United States in terms of developing its economy. But one thing that I started off with was an observation, and you could see it play out throughout American history, that the United States has always been resource rich. Like when you look at the factors of production, right? The factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. That's a framework for thinking about it. And land meaning all natural resources, labor meaning any kind of work that's provided by people or technology. Capital meaning accumulated savings that can be deployed then to develop the economy. The United States was always rich in land and natural resources, and never had enough people to develop that. This is going to cause, if you look at it from a Native American perspective, it's not that. No, they're not going to buy that. But that's from a sort of developmental point of view, becoming a modern economy. That was the issue, and so you had, sadly, the slave trade, which was one way of meeting that need. More sustainably and respecting of human rights was immigration. And then you also had the development of the labor saving technology. So the focus of technology has always been on how do we do more with less labor input, right? And the reason I posed this to my Chinese students was I said that China actually has the opposite. China is a resource poor economy and labor rich economy. Now it's somewhat changing because of demographics, but nevertheless, still resource poor, labor rich. And so it creates an entire different dynamic. And I was also suggesting to them that perhaps then the appropriate technological response would be resource saving technology as opposed to labor saving technology, which is something that they're actually doing with green energy and things like that, because they know that is both an economic and strategic vulnerability for them. The fact that they don't have enough natural resources to be either energy or input independent. So this is, I think, a way of thinking about the U.S. dilemma, right? And if you're now going to say, okay, in an economy which has always looked to labor, like as a precious resource, that we're going to constrain that further. That creates implications, and not necessarily good ones for the outlook of the economy.
So then when you add on to all of that, the austerity, the cuts in the big beautiful bill, and even like a lot of those, like I think about the Medicaid cuts, which are going to hit rural hospitals the hardest, and rural hospitals tend to not only be the largest employer in a lot of these small towns, they're also the largest consumer in a lot of these small towns. And so you've already got, farmers that are struggling. Then you have the hospitals, that could go under. Like entire towns could collapse because all the structure, everything that's the structure of all the businesses around it that keep the other businesses afloat.
So I think here we have
disappear.
kind of, there's a moral aspect to this, and then there's a practical economic aspect. And the moral aspect, I would say, from a statesmanship point of view, is that even if you think things should be done differently, even if you believe that Medicare is not sustainable the way it's designed, or Medicaid, or what have you, if you think that there needs to be entitlement reform in the United States, or that money's being spent in the wrong places, et cetera, what you can't do, and this is even from a conservative point of view, I mean, like a classic small c conservative, right, is you should not pull the rug out from under people in terms of what they've come to depend upon. Right? So there are structures that people rely on. They may be imperfect. They might not be sustainable in certain ways and should be reformed. But if you come in with Doge and you have envisioning Elon with his chainsaw, right?
Yeah.
And you come in with the bulldozer and you start just pulling plugs out of the wall, right? You don't even know what those plugs are attached to.
And how many times did they lay off people and then try to unlay them off?
Exactly. And you start just creating chaos, which is not really reform. Chaos is not reform. And so that's one thing that I would point out. The other thing does get to the issue of, okay, so we do have growing national debt in this country. It does raise concerns about our future. Interestingly, when you look at it, there's I think a lot of people imagine that the federal government is just full of all sorts of waste, fraud, and abuse, and just goofy programs that we spend money on, and studying the mating habits of whatever, and that those things could be easily cut and nobody would miss them. That sort of stuff, right, good and bad, is called discretionary spending. Things that the government isn't obliged to spend money on. It's just that, okay, we think this is a good investment. We're going to build this bridge. We're going to sponsor this research, et cetera. That is becoming a smaller and smaller and smaller part of the federal budget. And what is being crowded out by is what's called either mandatory or entitlement spending, which is the big programs, right, that are meant to support an aging population or people who are disabled or whatever, right? And these are programs that are set up that the spending is not appropriated by Congress every year. The spending is just like, if you meet the criteria for this program, you will get this payout. The issue is, because of demographics, because of
aging,
arguably the need to support the consumer side of the economy, that this is crowding out the rest of it. And so what's happening is money that's being spent on supporting consumption, supporting a lifestyle that we would all like to live, right, is crowding out what can arguably be described as investment. Investment in infrastructure, investment in research, investment in different things that hopefully it's a good investment. It's being decided on political grounds, so it's hard to say whether it's economically a good investment or not. But hopefully Much of this is good investment that will pay off by creating new technologies or by allowing us to transport goods or things like this. And my concern is that not that you want to, again, pull the legs out from under people who rely on government programs for certain things, but just that in the broader picture, I'm concerned that we're eating our seed corn. We are living at a level of standard of living that we want to live at, but that at least in terms of government spending, that it is increasingly edging out investments that ultimately will make us more productive.
Would another way of approaching that be to increase revenue by raising taxes?
So yes. So that's where the debate can be had, right? About what, and I think sadly, there was, when I can't remember the year exactly. I'm gonna say that it was in Obama's second term. There was discussion of going to the Republican-held Congress and proposing revenue neutral tax reform, corporate tax reform in particular. And the idea would be lower the rate, broaden the base, so that you had what was happening was that there was the corporate tax level in the United States was higher than a lot of other countries, but a lot of companies didn't pay it. And so it was very uneven. Mm-hmm. So those who paid a higher rate than in other countries, but a lot found ways of not paying it. And so the better way would be to a situation where you had everybody pays the same rate, and it doesn't necessarily have to be as high. And I think there was a prospect there of actual bipartisan agreement, and mm-hmm. that did not happen under Obama, and it didn't happen under Trump. And what ended up, Trump just said, "Okay, we're just going to lower the rate, period." Right? And I think that there
and a lot of the rich companies still don't pay any.
I think there is a huge missed opportunity. There has been a huge missed opportunity to come up with a tax system that is fairer, and then we can debate how high or low it should be to get the revenues that we need. Because
you're not like advocating for trickle down economics. You're just saying that there needs to be money for investment, and there also needs to be.
Well, so you're putting me in a little bit of an interesting position because I am an old supply sider.
When you're obviously a Reagan Republican.
But that said, I think that there are. Well, what I think happened was that the thinking within the Republican Party ossified to the point where instead of really thinking about the tax system and saying, where do we want to create incentives and how do we create fairness and how do we raise the revenues that we want to raise, especially going into the 90s and then into the 21st century, it just became tax cuts are good and they pay for themselves, which there was an argument back in the late 1970s that certain taxes were so high that was true. But as this is an overall statement of fact, that is not true all the time or even most of the time. And yet it became sort of a reflexive way of thinking within the Republican Party as it became a replacement for thinking. It became a replacement for actually thinking about the economy. So that's where I guess what I'm arguing is that we can disagree. People can disagree and have meaningful, mm-hmm. substantive debates about what kind of tax system is fair and what kind of tax system creates the right incentives in the economy, and how much we need to rely on more revenue versus how much we've gotten in over our skis in terms of spending in certain ways. But I think that aside, there is a structural issue, which is that there's a budget that increasingly is going towards supporting consumption instead of supporting investment. and that we either need to decide that we need to put up more revenue and fund both of those, or we need to start thinking about that balance.
So
Because
what about
what
like
I see is
what about
people,
like
Trump,
giving
what Trump
billions
is
of
going in,
dollars?
right?
What about
Because what
giving
Trump is
billions
going,
of dollars to Elon Musk? Sorry.
yeah,
Like he doesn't have enough money to invest into SpaceX himself. He needs a federal contract. Like I get that, like the whole idea is people don't have money to invest, so they can't invest, but they have money to invest. They're not investing it, but the government is still spending money on those while they're cutting Medicaid and things like that. And
right.
while they're also giving like corporate bailouts and giving money, like
Well,
why can't we take some of the money out of that? Or you know what I'm
I
saying?
think the big issue right now with the government shutdown is that just like when
It's Reagan's fault. The
well,
shutdown is
well,
Reagan's fault.
well, just like when they tried to repeal
Uh-huh.
Obamacare without a replacement,
Yeah.
right? Now they're trying to cut the subsidies for Obamacare premiums without a credible replacement. They're not
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, hey,
We
Trump would
have
always say." Trump would always say, "I have this great plan, and everybody's going to love it, and everything else." And it's been what? It's been 10 years,
well,
and
it's
we've
2
never
weeks
heard
away
anything.
though. It's 2 weeks away.
Right, of course. But the problem is that, okay, if you have something better, right, to put on the table, then put it on the table and we can debate that. And we can say, is this actually a better way to spend money and a better way to accomplish things? Look, we are always going to have debates in this country about priorities
Well,
because it's going to reflect
hopefully
different.
we're allowed to.
Right, right.
Don't know what the direction we're going. Debates might be illegal pretty soon.
So, but we need to have honest debates.
Yeah.
And we need and the criteria should always be truth, right? If I'm making an argument, then I should have to put up some facts and defend myself
Mhm.
against
Right.
facts. I can't just make up my own set of facts and assert it loudly on cable TV, and that somehow is a replacement for actually evaluating what the real consequences of policy are.
So Donald Trump isn't reducing the price of medicine by 500%.
No, that would be very interesting if he did that, because we would all be paid a great deal of money.
That's what I'm just hoping that would apply to something like medical marijuana or something, because
right. Well, when we have so when we have conversations like that, where the president simply asserts, "I have reduced drug prices by 5,000%," we are in la la land. We're not talking about trade-offs. We're not talking about things that you or I might agree or disagree about, right? You and I can sit down and have a discussion about, should taxes be higher? Should taxes be lower? Should we spend money on this? Should we spend money on that? And if it's grounded in reality, that's a conversation to have. But if I say, I magically gave everyone a pony and a unicorn, and you should thank me for it, we're not talking about reality anymore.
So like right now, and sorry for the Ronald Reagan joke there. I was joking because he's the one that signed into law that you have to take care of anybody that comes to the emergency room, which is what the Republicans are using as their argument for, they're saying that the Democrats just want to give free health care insurance to the illegals. And, that's what they mean by it is if, like a Hispanic woman comes in and she doesn't have her ID on her and she needs life-saving care, they should just let her die. I don't know what all that's about. But
yeah, and I think this is where
like this totally dishonest, and Ronald Reagan's the one that signed that into law when she should have. And so what you're talking about is that there needs to be honest communication about really what is the problem with healthcare. Let's actually talk about how we can solve this issue, not just have this, made up propaganda about Democrats, wanting to give illegal immigrants free healthcare.
Right. My own view is that neither party fully comes to terms with the complexity of healthcare being both. It's a combination of what economists would call a private good and a public good. Okay? And what we mean, what private good means, that it's something that can be exchanged in the marketplace and for value. Public good means that it's something that, because that doesn't work, because there are overriding issues that don't make a market work, that it must be provided collectively. And I would argue that healthcare is a complex combination of both of those. That there are elements of it that are like a private good, and there are elements of it that are like a public good. And that, for instance, the fact that we don't deny emergency care to anyone as sort of a moral foundation of the healthcare profession,
Right.
that then that's a non-market, that's not a market transaction. That's a commitment, right? That is a public commitment. And once you start introducing those things, then you have to acknowledge that that's a reality, right? You have to acknowledge that, for instance, this was the basis for Medicare being founded, was that older people are not insurable. I mean, just in a market sense, in a commercial sense, because they're gonna cost more than any premium you could possibly get from them. And so therefore it becomes a public good. It becomes a provision of a public good. And we are all taxed in order to pay for that eventually in our lives. And that, a recognition that that's just a reality, that we don't want a purely private healthcare system, would be a starting point for Republicans. And I would then I get in my arguments with Democrats about whether healthcare is a right and whether they recognize that, in fact, it's a good that's being provided and always comes with a cost, and in many cases should be conducted on a commercial basis. But I would say to both that this is the complexity of healthcare, is that I think we want a healthcare system that is responsive to market dynamics, particularly when it comes to innovation and creation of new technologies and cares. But then we also want one that isn't purely done on that basis and treats people who can't afford it.
So if somebody, like, were to ask you, every other democracy in the world that has a robust economy has managed to figure out how to do state-funded healthcare, not state-run, but state-funded healthcare. Why can't America?
I mean, partly it's because we do prioritize different things in terms of the responsiveness of our healthcare system. There is, I think, a dynamism that exists within a commercial dynamism that exists within the U.S. healthcare system. It doesn't exist elsewhere. There is also I will fully acknowledge a system that's not really geared, partly because of history, because of the way that it developed with being employment related, which was filling in gaps at the time, but then left lots of gaps unfilled. And I think that the danger of a state-funded or state-run system is that it makes costs invisible, that it appears to be free when it in fact is not, and rationing takes place. It's not market rationing, it's political-based rationing. So there's always going to be economics. We'll get back to what economics is. Economics is about meeting unlimited human needs or desires with limited resources. And that can be done in different ways. And there are different mechanisms for that. One is the marketplace, right? The other is political spending. We decide as a people that we're going to do something and we're going to provide national defense for everybody. And that's not going to be pick or choose, or we're going to have police services for everyone, right? And it's not going to be pick or choose whether you contribute, how much you contributed. And so the allocation, right, because of history, the allocation in the United States is focused more on healthcare as a private good. And I think that there have been some benefits from that, but there have also been some very serious downsides from that. And I would also say that in systems that are like Britain, that are purely, really primarily government run, right, there is a sense that, well, my healthcare is free. document. It's not. It's actually not free at all. And there are choices being made, but those choices aren't being made in a visible marketplace. They're being made in halls of political decision making. So I just don't think that. I guess where I come down is that I think that whether you're approaching it saying it's too much of a private good, should be more treated as a public good, or whether you're saying, hey, I understand what you're saying about public good, but I think it's great that it's a private good. We're not having a conversation about how it is actually a complex mix of both. And that means that there are that the holding up the sign of healthcare for everyone versus healthcare should be get your government out of my healthcare, ignore that complex reality.
So if I can sum up pretty much everything you said, a big part of the reason that we can't solve anything is we're so busy. And I don't mean me and you here. I mean, like, nationally and especially politically on both sides. We're not having honest conversations because we're too busy trying to have dishonest ones. And like all of our discourses, I always think of the gun rights, right? Where it's like there are some people that would say you have a right to own a gun no matter what. I don't care if you're a bona fide terrorist. You should be able to walk into Walmart and buy an AR-15 and a 50 round magazine and 2,000 bullets and just buy it on the spot. There are some people that think that. And then there are some people say, we just shouldn't sell guns at all in this country. Nobody should ever be able to allow a gun. And it's almost like most of our discourse is driven by those two groups. And you got 80%. Okay, if somebody buys a gun for self-defense or
I'm seeing you. I don't know whether everybody else is seeing this, but
I saw a little spirally thing on my
screen. There was a little,
Okay. So so there's some people that, like, I think most of us agree the answer is somewhere in the middle. The answer is not whether or not we have gun control. You can't have gun control if everybody can buy a gun, and you can't have gun control if nobody can buy a gun. Like 80% of us agree on gun control, but we need to have a discussion about where exactly is that, Well, and I think that we don't have the honest conversations because we're too busy letting the polar opposites drive the conversation, and we just have these dishonest conversations. So just as a metaphor, this seems like what you're saying.
Yes, and I think rather than just stop there and just complain about it and say, "Oh, that's so terrible," digging a little deeper, why is that the case? Why has our conversation devolved so that we're no longer having real, meaningful conversations? And I think that there are a couple things. The first is the political primary system right now in the United States and the safe seats, right, especially in the House. The tendency that that you have these safe seats that are either safe for Republicans or safe for Democrats, and therefore, they've been created that way so that people can get reelected without worrying too much, without breaking too much of a sweat. And then what happens is the election that matters is the party primary. And the party primary, the electorate is narrowed down to the most active, most committed, probably farther on the right or the left than the average voter, and who they want as the nominee. And then once those nominees are put up, that's it. That's the choice. There's no other choice.
Yeah.
And I kind of think I look at what Australia has with ranked choice voting and saying that, it's not a binary choice, that you can say, this is my first pick, this is my second pick, this is my third pick. And that opens it up for somebody who may not have necessarily secured one party's nomination. I think it cracks that open where somebody could be everyone's number 2 choice and actually get elected. And so, but this dynamic creates a situation where increasingly you have very few people in Congress who have any real electoral benefit from working with anybody who's different from them to actually reach an agreement on anything.
Mhm.
They'd rather have the issues to run on and say, look at how terrible these people are. I'm the only thing standing between you and them.
Especially when your own the president, who is a member of your own party, is threatening to primary you if you disagree with him.
Yes, yes. And so when you have members of Congress whose main concern is,
hey, this is the
losing a
pun show.
primary.
Even accidental puns are allowed.
Yeah, when that is a recipe for not having actual solutions and working together on compromises. When you look back in American history, right, there were always seats in play, and there were always seats that could go one way or the other. And people had to think, what am I going to go home and say I delivered to my constituents? Not just in terms of money or projects, but just in terms of something that practically addressed what they're concerned about. And the ability to do that was the mark of a successful legislator. People don't legislate anymore in Congress. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with the power of the executive right now and all the edicts that are being issued is partly, yes, you have Trump, who sees himself as all powerful monarch, but it's also the fading of Congress as an effective institution, as one that can actually deliver on compromises that don't make everybody happy, but address things that constituents are demanding. And if they don't get results on, they're not going to come back. And,
ironically, the last person I can think of that was really effective at that, when he was in Congress, Joe Biden, he was extremely effective.
I think almost all of them were, and they had to be, because if they weren't, they were seen as ineffective. And right now, if you think about what members of Congress are known for, right, they're known for appearing on spots on interview shows, not on legislating. Yeah. That's not the job description.
All about the viral clips now.
And also the filibuster, which I think has become a real impediment to, and that's not, it doesn't depend on which party's in power. Look, the Constitution says that if that most bills in Congress are passed with a majority in the Senate. And what we've replaced that with is a de facto supermajority requirement of 60 votes. And in a country that's divided enough that nobody can get 60 votes on anything of any substance.
And it's even reported that way. Like they need 60 votes. And you know what's interesting that nobody knows about the filibuster? The majority leader of both parties has to agree each term, like to allow it to happen. There's some things that they can do to just stop the filibuster. The other thing, like what you just said, I think it's now over 3/4 of all the filibusters in American history have come since Obama was elected. So it's definitely,
it's definitely changed. It's become the de facto mode of governing instead of the exception. When we think of filibuster, we think of
Mr. Smith goes to Washington or whatever.
Right, you stand there and you have to actually stay awake for days on end. Well, the point is, it requires some effort, right? And it's the exception, not the rule. Where if you really think that your fellow senators are not fully deliberating on this issue and considering the impassioned position of a minority, that you can stand there and make them for at least a while think about that. That's fine. I don't think anybody has any objection to that. I think the objection comes when it becomes simply a de facto supermajority requirement.
Yeah, and that's
nowhere in the Constitution.
There's a rule that what it used to be back in the 70s. The rule was that you could only bring one thing forward at a time, and that issue had to be resolved before you brought up the next one. So a filibuster wouldn't just stop that bill from going forward. Senate couldn't do anything until that moved forward. And then
of course, there was then counter pressure that we have to do certain things. And so
what they did
there's a check and a balance, right? There's a tension.
You can let that sit and only by the agreement of the leaders of both parties. And so then and that just, it increasingly, it
Well,
became
what it means is that
increasingly
Congress
more used, and now it's just
what it
always used.
means is that
Every
Congress
single
has
bill
become
needs 6.
ineffective, right? So because no legislation of substance can be passed through the Senate, that means that effectively, if you want something addressed, the president has to do it in an executive order, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, and that Congress will simply defer to the president doing that because they know that they can't do anything. And the only thing that is left for them to do is to go on TV and argue with each other and be kind of policy celebrities, not even policy, just kind of ideological celebrities,
Yeah.
and talking heads. And that is really, I think,
that's where you get into the team thing. Like my favorite team is this. And we've lost, which I think is our main point here. We've lost the ability to have discourse. Like I think about Clinton, and you probably didn't vote for him, as my guess, but just on I think what he did extremely effectively was not talk to other voters, but to people who voted for Republicans.
Mhm.
Like he connected with people by talking about real concerns, and and he would say something, and he would explain a problem, and then he'd be like, and here's why, and then he would explain it, and then he'd say, and there's how you fix it, and he would really clearly articulate a solution. So he actually talked to people. He didn't talk to Democrats, and he didn't talk to Republicans. He talked to people. And I think that kind of honest discourse is what we need to return to. Even if you didn't agree with what he said,
I think it's
he
important
had a
to
way of
realize
communicating.
that was what we're talking about here is not just like, oh, well, they were better people back then, but it's more like the dynamics or the incentive structure was different, so that yes,
right. There was no Twitter, there weren't viral videos. There was just,
you go back to
yeah.
Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, or Clinton and Gingrich, or what, even go back further than that, and you say, look, they call each other names, they call each other plain names, they had their talking points, they knocked each other down, but at the end of the day, the incentives in the political system were such that they had to come to terms with each other, and they had to figure out how they were going to go home and talk to constituents about what they had done. And that led to compromises that neither side was particularly happy about, and yet was the bread and butter of a functioning democracy.
I think it was Reagan that said, if everybody's happy, it's not a good compromise. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, or if anybody's happy, it's not a compromise.
Yeah. So yes, I do think that you're right, including in that I am concerned that whether it's immigration, or whether it is tariffs, or whether it is, name any number of healthcare, that we are not having honest discussions, that we are bandying about slogans, and that we are rewarded for bandying about slogans rather than delivering solutions. And I think that there are some structural reasons why that's the case. I think maybe we might be able to fix some of them by changing them, but I don't see that as something that is, I think it's easier for people to say, oh, we're just not as virtuous as the people who came before us. And I don't really think that that's the case. I just think that the genius of American government has never been that we were all virtuous people. It was that the incentive structure of the Constitution created a mechanism for people to be forced to get along and come up with solutions.
And the Constitution wasn't drafted to be between two parties.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Senate was supposed to be two senators.
Although it has done fairly well, even despite that.
Yeah, it's held up pretty good up until now. But like even the whole reason the filibuster came out is because parties started to form naturally, and then it's like all of a sudden one party couldn't get anything. Like it might as well not existed at all.
So I mean, getting back to sort of, you had me on because I'm an economist, and I'll put my economist hat on and say, that one thing that is drilled into you as an economist is there are no perfect solutions. There are trade-offs. That every decision, right, to invest in this instead of invest in that, or to have this policy instead of that policy, they all create winners or losers. They all create pros and cons. They all create, and this is not a Manichaean sort of thing where, you know, we are the children of light and they are the children of darkness, and unless we win, they're going to. So an honest policy debate consists of saying, well, look, here are the upsides of what I want to do, and admittedly, here are some downsides. Here are some negatives, and things that may look like small negatives now, but may even grow to become bigger negatives later, right? And if I can acknowledge that my set of priorities is not perfect, that it has downsides as well as upsides, I think we're on the path to having more honest discussions.
I think,
but how often have you heard anybody say such a thing, right?
But, and I do think
what I'm proposing does have some downsides.
Yeah. I think you're a child of the 80s, you're Gen X, right? Like, I think we grew up more. I graduated from high school in 85, like right in the middle of the 80s.
88. So
80. Yeah. So yeah. We both watched The Breakfast Club when we were in high school. Like we are Gen X, right? and we grew up on both sides of it. And my first vote was a happy vote for Dukakis. I don't think if you would have been old enough, maybe.
I voted. Yes, I was just yes, and I voted for Bush in that election. So.
And you know what? Oh, so after a year later, I got stationed to Italy, and while I was in Italy, they were celebrating. I think it was the liberation of Italy during World War II from Mussolini and everything. And Bush was there, and the president was there too. People got appointed from each squadron to go march in this parade in Rome, and I was one of them. And so as we were there, I went to the parade, and then Bush came around and shook all our hands and everything. And so he shook my hand, and I said, he asked, "Did you vote for me?" I said, "No, sir, I voted for Dukakis, but I'm still proud to march in a parade for you." And then he said, "Thanks for doing your service and voting." Like, that is not a kind of thing I could hear Trump saying. I think we've lost that ability to like be honest and communicate honestly but respectfully. And I think
and I can also
have more conversations like we are having. We grew up on different sides of the aisle, but we can have this civil discourse.
And I can also
why can't our representatives? Why can't our senators?
And I can also acknowledge that there were policies that I advocated through the 80s and the 90s that then subsequently I look back and I see some downsides. I can see that there were the seeds of different issues that developed and problems that emerged out of it. Even if I don't reject what I believed, right? Even if I think, well, okay, I think that was the right decision at the time, or that was the important thing at the time, I can still acknowledge that everything that we do has unforeseen consequences. And we do the best we can. And that's why we need to hear different points of view from people who disagree with us. And that's always a problem, I think, in the presidency, in the White House, is for it to become an echo chamber, always, because it's always sort of a presidential court, right? In which you want to say something that pleases the president, and it's hard for the president to hear the truth. I think that's taken to the nth level now, where you've got people who are just yes men, and anybody who in the first term would have told him no is now gone.
Well, because they're afraid of being prosecuted. Like, he's actually prosecuting people for disagreeing with him. It's not even hypothetical anymore.
So, well, so the initial question you asked is, are we heading for economic trouble? And what I would say is that we're pressing our luck. We're pressing our luck on a number of fronts. And I don't think it's dawned on a lot of people, because I think they're optimistic about AI. And I think that things haven't come completely unglued. But there is a drip, drip, drip effect, not just about the costs of specific policies. We've talked about a couple, but also about overall credibility. And one thing I worry about is, for instance, the dollar. One of the things you saw, usually when the market goes down, the dollar goes up, where people, they flock to the dollar as a source of stability. And put your money in treasuries, and that'll be safe. And one of the things we saw in the spring when the market went down because of Trump's tariff announcements was that the dollar didn't rise, that people didn't go into treasuries. And because I think that there was a question about whether the United States is a safe pair of hands.
How do you think that doing things like firing the director of the Labor Bureau or whatever that was, and
So
like,
we will
are people
see.
going to lose confidence in,
Well,
like official government reporting?
We shall see, right? One thing, so all of those are on hold now because of the government shutdown. And so we're not seeing those kind of data releases right now, and we've missed a couple. But I think people will take a skeptical eye. They won't necessarily reject them out of hand, but there is going to be some concern about, are these numbers just being fluffed in order to project an image rather than really project a idea about what's happening in the real economy. And I'm not ringing alarm bells in that respect.
Is it something like, if they worded, like they've always, it's not like they just released the numbers, right? They released the supporting structure behind it, and always
to
have.
some degree, yes. So it's a pretty transparent.
So if they were to fluff the numbers, I might be able to look at them and not see what's wrong with them. Would you be able to?
It depends on what they do. It's not a simple procedure to just put out a fake number. But there are levels of transparency, and they've even discussed reducing those levels of transparency. And I think that would raise concerns if we started to see less and less of what the calculation actually was, and more of just, here's a number, you don't need to know, just believe it. Then I think you do begin to have people wonder what's going on. And any move towards that, right? Credibility is not a binary thing. Credibility is not something that, well, you either have it or you don't. It's something that you can lose gradually and then suddenly. And I would say the same thing about the credibility of the dollar as something that people want to hold around the world. It is, it's not like, oh, okay, Trump tweets something and now all of a sudden there's a run on the dollar. It's more like drip, 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 all of which doesn't seem to have any impact at all. And then maybe something happens that the market reaction is completely different than anybody saw before, because that credibility has been eroded and the assumptions no longer hold. That is, and you usually only find that out too late. So you want to be a good custodian, not because you can't abuse, you can abuse your status as a custodian of the global economy or global markets. You can do that up to a point. But every time you do it, you heighten the risk that at some point people aren't going to take you seriously anymore. And
so it's like, you can skip your credit card payment one time and maybe be okay, but you keep doing that, your credit rating is going to start going down, and then you're not going to get any more credit.
Right. So this is where I think some enlightened self-interest from a financial custodianship point of view. And this is where I think, oh, what do mean tweets matter? And let's just say he announces a 100% tariff, and the next day he has a second thought and says, oh, no, we don't need to do that because I struck a great deal. And then everybody breathes a sigh of relief and everything else. But repeated episodes like that introduce this erosion of credibility, so that when you actually want to say something and mean it, nobody really believes it. Mm-hmm. And that I think is where you don't see the cost of that until too late. And that's, I worry about that.
I just had an idea for a political credit rating. I think that'd be a good idea. Like, it's like based on like just based on your previous statements and everything
okay,
like that.
as long as we're not talking about China's social credit rating, right? Where everybody gets a
I didn't or that episode of Black Mirror. I don't know if you've seen it.
I have not. I only lived the being in China, and if you say this, maybe you won't be able to buy bus tickets anymore, kind of thing.
I didn't know about that. No, I'm just talking. I was thinking like just for candidates running for office, just have a website where everybody gets a political credit rating, just based on what.
Well, we try, right? I mean, there's
not
no
based
lack
on
of
whether
ratings,
it's right or left, but whether it's just true or not.
There's no lack of ratings, but people just don't. They
pay attention.
They more want to hear what they want to hear.
Yeah.
Than anything else. So
I think this is a great conversation, and I like to think I don't have to agree with everybody that comes on my show and everything they say, but I find if I have a diversity of people on, I learn from every single guest, and I've learned from you, and you've given me things to think about, especially with this notion of everything is an exchange. The less money you have, the more money you spend here, the less money you have to spend there. That's really something I'm going to have to percolate on.
When you frame it that way, the MMT people, modern monetary theory people, are going to have a fit, because the more they say, well, you can create as much money as you need. Really, it's resources. It's actual real resources with time, labor, all the things that we have that are not like just symbols. Right? Yeah. We have limited resources, and we have to decide, and there are different mechanisms that we have to allocate them. And all policies involve choices that have upsides and downsides.
So I'm gonna think a lot about that. I think that is something that's helpful. And do you have a book, right? You have anything you want to pitch? I always give people a chance to pitch.
Well, we haven't talked at all about my flying interest, except for when I talked about pilot shortage. During COVID, I did something I completely did not expect to do, which was learn how to fly an airplane. I ended up writing a book about it. People can check it out if they're really interested in that. It's kind of a nerdy book about all the things that you really do learn when you learn how to fly, for people who, are actually have thought about maybe I might want to do that. So I wrote a book for them, and it was really partly a way of me teaching myself how to write a book. Everyone expected me to write a book about economics or write a book about China or things like that. I ended up writing a book about flying an airplane. And if you're interested, check it out. I am doing a lot of research on a topic that we haven't discussed, which is U.S.-China relations. I mean, it's something that's obviously close to my heart and part of my life. Yeah, and really trying to communicate about what a war between China and the United States would actually look like, because that's something that I've often been asked about. And I've been spent almost a year doing research and travel, and in addition to having lived much of my life in Asia.
So in relation to that specific thing, what do you think about China's recent response to like restrict exports? And is that like a chess move on their side? Do we have a counter move?
It is a chess move on their part, but it's not a foolproof one. The reason why China has a dominant position, or some might say a monopoly, it's not quite a monopoly, but a dominant position in rare earth minerals, is because it's convenient for everyone. That processing rare earth minerals and mining them is a very polluting process. And China has been willing to accept that cost of pollution and sell cheaply to the rest of the world and provide that. It's not because rare earth minerals are really rare. They're not. They can be found around the world. It's that actually developing those deposits come with a lot of costs associated that people would rather not take on and would rather outsource to China. The problem, of course, then becomes if China becomes an unreliable source, right? Then you start looking at the other options, even if they're not your preferred option. The issue is that it takes many years, many even decades to develop those alternatives. And there are. This really began, this got on people's radar screen in 2010 when China had a dispute with Japan over some islands in the East China Sea. And suddenly they basically embargoed rare earth minerals that were going to Japan that go into their electronics industry. And Japan didn't see this coming at all. And so they didn't have any stockpiles or anything else. And it was a real impact. But when that happened, then everybody said, okay, well, this could happen, right? And Japan and other countries began to develop stockpiles and began to explore other places like Australia, where they might be able to develop these resources. But again, because it's something that comes with pollution and it comes with, it's not always profitable in comparison.
Well, when it comes to like pollution and, climate change, which is an obvious concern, is that now being factored into the cost trade-off of things? Like not just like,
well, that was the whole idea behind carbon pricing, right? Was a carbon tax, right? Would be that you had to pay for, because you had to pay for it, then it got factored in. So what people factor in a marketplace is what costs they are actually imposed on them. And so the rationale was, if there are these costs that are out there that nobody's paying, the government should impose that cost on people for their decisions, and then that would shape their behavior. And in this case, the issue is, well, how much should we subsidize the development of a heavily polluting industry at home for the day that might come that China decides to cut us off? And that, if you're a hawk on China and you think that day is coming and it's going to be really bad, then you say, do it. And if you're living next to the facility, you say, really?
Or do you have a grandchildren
somewhere else?
You have in a functional civilization in the year 2100? I mean, I think all of these things, a lot of nuance and a lot of things to consider, and just yelling at each other solves nothing. You actually have to consider the nuances to get solutions.
So the answer to your question is that we've kind of been bogged down in this debate about how to respond to China's dominant position in these minerals, and there's been some motion in some quarters. There are some projects in Australia, for instance, that have gotten moving, and there's been not as much movement on other fronts. So China's portion of the world market has declined, but it still is in a dominant position. So it still is a card for them to play, especially in the short term.
Gotcha. So right now they're at check, not checkmate.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I think that's correct.
So and your book, if you wanted to, I can put a
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's maybe of interest to people who have followed our conversation so far. It's on a very different topic, but I'll put in my little spiel, which is that all of us fly. Every single one of us get on a plane, and we don't think about we either think that it's something that is completely inaccessible, right, to us. We glance into that cockpit and there's all these lights and switches, and like, how would you even make sense of that? It's either completely inaccessible and something somebody else does, or it's just something we take for granted and we look out the window and say, oh yeah, I'm 30,000 feet, whatever. Yeah. And we don't sit and think about what a miracle it is. So the process of learning how to fly was really educational to me, in that something that I have done all my life became that much more meaningful, and also something that I understood for the first time. And so that's one of the reasons I told that story.
Plus, when you're up in a plane all by yourself in the year 2020, you don't have to worry about social distancing.
Well, and let me tell you something. It does tie into some of the things that we were talking about. And I said this at one point in my book, without getting too political. I said that a plane, you don't argue with the ground, right? It's a reality. Like, you either know how to land the plane or you don't. It's not a conversation. It's up for debate. And so the discipline of facing reality, the discipline of not just, well, I've got your opinion, I've got my opinion, you've got your opinion, and the person who wins is the person who makes a bigger splash. Okay, that's not how flying a plane works. I don't have it. It doesn't matter what my opinion is about my ability to land it, right? Or fly it safely. So that discipline of doing something that actually requires you to be centered on reality and accountable to reality and develop your skills and develop your understanding, that's something that, I don't know, it's in this opinion dominated age, right? I think that has value.
Yeah.
To actually master something that's difficult and doesn't care about your feelings.
Yeah. So that could be the ground doesn't care about you. You know how Ben Shapiro says facts don't care about you. The ground doesn't care about your feelings.
No, it doesn't care about your enthusiasm or your feelings. It just cares about your competence in not ending up occupying the same space. There was a real value to that, and I think that if our politics became more like that, that would be a good thing. Well, I say that, but that's where I worry that maybe the thing which wakes us up is an event like a U.S.-China war, where
I would have hoped it would have been like a pandemic that killed 5 million people worldwide.
Yes, well, one would have thought, right? Yes, exactly.
Or somebody trying to actually overthrow the country. Like we've gone through so many, just blasted through so many
reality checks. It should have been reality checks that weren't.
Yeah. So Patrick, appreciate you coming on. We just met on Blue Sky. You made some comments I found interesting, and coming on, giving up your time, and I really have learned a lot from you. So yeah, thanks.
Okay. Hey, it was great to meet you and great to be with you.
Okay. Just stream is ending now. So anyway.